The apple tree at the bottom of the garden in Oakhaven had always been our sovereign territory. It was a gnarled, stubborn thing, prone to producing fruit that was slightly too tart for crumbles, but perfectly suited for hurling at imaginary dragons. I remember the day Arthur Penhilligan decided he was far too grown up for dragons. He was 14, smelling of peppermint and the rain-slicked wool of his school jumper, while I was a mess-a-haired scrap of a thing, barely reaching his elbow. "I'm going away, Poppy," he'd said, his voice cracking just a tiny bit, though he'd have died before admitting it. To the city, for school, and then probably to the moon or something equally important. I had stared at him, my lower lip wobbling in a way that I found deeply betraying. I was 7. To me, the city was a mythical place where people wore suits and forgot how to climb trees. But who's going to fix my bicycle chain? And who's going to tell the spiders in the shed to move house before I go in? Arthur had laughed, that warm, low sound that always felt like a thick scarf on a Tuesday morning. He reached out and tugged on one of my messy plaits. "You'll have to learn to talk to the spiders yourself, Pops, but tell you what, I'll come back once you're all grown up and tall enough to reach the top branch of this tree without a ladder. Wait for me until then." "Cross your heart?" I asked, sticking out my pinky finger. "And hope to fly," he whispered, linking his finger with mine. That was the promise, a silly, golden thread spun between two children in a Devon garden. Arthur went off to London, then to university, and then into the frantic, grey world of corporate law. And I stayed in Oakhaven. I grew, though perhaps not as tall as the top branch. I grew in sideways directions, mostly in the form of messy hobbies and a collection of mismatched socks. Being grown up turned out to be much more complicated than Arthur had led me to believe. I thought it would involve high heels and knowing exactly how to cook a sofal. Instead, at 23, I found myself working at the local nursery, covered in finger paint and mud, still occasionally tripping over my own feet. My life was a series of enthusiastic accidents. I once tried to make artisanal elderberry wine and ended up turning the entire kitchen purple. Mum just sighed and handed me a sponge. "You've got a heart like a sunbeam, Poppy," she'd say, "but your hands are definitely operated by a very clumsy, mischievous sprite." I didn't mind. Life was too lovely to spend it worrying about purple ceilings. Every month, a postcard arrived from Arthur. They were brief, written in a cramped hand that looked like it was in a hurry to be somewhere else. "Saw a pigeon today that looked like your old hat. Coffee here tastes like burnt toast. Working late again." I wrote back with long, rambling letters that smelled of pressed wildflowers. "I fell into the duck pond yesterday." The ducks were very offended, especially the one with the green head. "I think his name is Barnaby. I've decided to teach the toddlers how to grow sunflowers, but Timmy tried to eat the soil. It's all very exciting." I wondered if he still remembered the tree. I wondered if he still remembered the pinky swear. Then, one Tuesday, the world shifted. It wasn't a grand explosion. It was the sound of a gravel driveway crunching under the weight of a car that didn't belong in Oakhaven. It was a sleek, silver thing, looking entirely out of place next to my rusted bicycle, Bessie. I was in the front garden, attempting to prune the roses and mostly just getting thorns caught in my cardigan. I looked up, a smudge of dirt likely decorating my nose, and there he was. Arthur. But he wasn't the Arthur from the apple tree. This man was thin to thin. His face was the color of old parchment, and there were dark hollows beneath his eyes that looked like they'd been dug by years of sleepless nights. He stood by the gate, his hand trembling slightly on the latch. He looked like a clock that had been wound to tight and was finally starting to snap. "Arthur," I squeaked, dropping my shears. They landed on my toe. "Ouch, oh, botheration and biscuits." He blinked, and for a second, a tiny spark of the old Arthur flickered in those weary eyes. "Poppy, you're still wearing that ridiculous cardigan." "It's a classic," I protested, hopping on one foot. And you're home, you didn't say. I would have baked something. Well, I would have tried to bake something, and we probably would have had to call the fire brigade. But it's the thought that counts. I scrambled over to him, forgetting the pain in my toe. I wanted to throw my arms around him, but he looked so fragile, like a glass bird. I settled for grabbing his hand. It was cold. I've quit, Pops, he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. I've quit everything. I think I forgot how to breathe in London. Well, I said, puffing out my chest and trying to look as tall as possible. You've come to the right place. Oakhaven is very good for breathing. We have some of the best oxygen in the county. Very fresh, hardly used. He gave a weak, jagged little smile. Are you grown up yet? I looked down at my mud-stained knees and then back at his tired face. Not even close, I said cheerfully. And thank goodness for that. Come on, Mum's put the kettle on, and I think there's a tin of digestive biscuits with your name on them. The weeks that followed were quiet. Arthur moved back into his parents' old cottage next door, which had been sitting empty for years. He spent a lot of time sitting on his porch, staring at the horizon. He didn't talk much. He didn't do much. It was like he was a battery that had been drained to zero and was struggling to hold a charge. I decided that if Arthur couldn't find his own joy, I'd just have to shove some of mine in his direction. I started leaving survival kits on his doorstep. One day it was a jar of wild honey and a book of silly limericks. Another day it was a bunch of particularly round pebbles I'd found at the beach. What am I supposed to do with these, Poppy? He asked one afternoon, holding up a pebble. They're grounding stones, I declared, swinging my legs from the wall. Whenever you feel like your brain is spinning off into London mode, you hold a pebble. It reminds you that the earth is solid and you aren't going to float away. He looked at the stone, then at me. You're very odd. I prefer the term characterfully enriched, I replied with a wink. Now, come on. The apple tree is dropping its early fruit, and if we don't gather them, the wasps will get drunk on the fermented ones and start fights. We can't have hooligan wasps in the garden. Arthur, it sets a bad example for the ladybirds. Slowly, ever so slowly, the grey started to lift from his skin. He began to help me in the garden. He was much better at pruning than I was. He actually had patience. He didn't just snip things at random because he saw a pretty butterfly. We talked about everything and nothing. I told him about the time I tried to start a choir for the elderly, and we accidentally ended up singing sea shanties at a funeral. It was a very lively send-off, at least. He told me about the high-pressure world he'd left behind the glass towers, the shouting, the feeling that if he stopped moving for even a second, he'd be replaced. I thought that was what being a man meant. He said one evening, his back against the trunk of our old apple tree. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of apricot and violet. I thought I had to be successful to be worth something. What a silly idea, I said, biting into a tart apple and pulling a face. You're worth something because you're Arthur. You're the person who knows which birds are which by their songs. You're the person who once built a hospital for broken grasshoppers. That's much more important than being a lawyer. He looked at me then, really looked at me. The shadows in his eyes were almost gone, replaced by a soft, wondering light. You really haven't changed, have you? I have, I insisted. I'm much better at ignoring the spiders now, and I've stopped trying to cut my own fringe, mostly. He reached out, his hand steady now, and brushed a stray curl from my forehead. I made you a promise, didn't I, to come back when you were grown up? You did, I whispered, my heart doing a strange little somersault. I think I got it wrong, Arthur said, his voice low and sincere. I thought I was waiting for you to grow up, but really, I think I was waiting for me to find my way back to the person I was when I was with you. You're the grown-up one. Pops, you know how to be happy. I'm still just a boy trying to figure out how to climb the tree. I felt a tear prickle my eye. but I quickly blinked it away. I didn't want to be sad. This wasn't a sad moment, it was a healing one. "Well," I said, standing up and brushing the grass off my skirt, "if you want to climb the tree, you'd better start practicing. I've decided we're going to build a treehouse." Arthur laughed a real, belly-shaking laugh that sounded like music. "A treehouse, at our age?" "Especially at our age," I shouted, already heading for the shed to find a hammer. "It'll have a library and a secret stash of biscuits, and no lawyers allowed unless they bring cake." He stood up, looking taller and stronger than I'd seen him in years. He followed me, his stride confident and light. Life in Oakhaven wasn't perfect. I still burnt the toast, and Arthur still had days where the city shadows tried to creep back in. But we had the tree. We had the promise, no longer a golden thread, but a sturdy bridge. One afternoon, months later, we finally finished the treehouse. It was a bit lopsided, and the paint was a shade of blue that was perhaps a bit too bright, but it was ours. We sat on the wooden deck, our legs dangling over the edge, looking out over the rolling Devon hills. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He took my hand, the one that wasn't covered in blue paint, and pressed a small, silver ring into my palm. It wasn't a diamond. It was shaped like a tiny, delicate apple blossom. "I don't want to wait any more," he said, his eyes bright and clear. "I don't care if we ever grow up properly. I just want to be with the girl who talks to ducks and teaches me how to breathe again. Poppy Miller, will you stay in this lopsided life with me?" I looked at the ring, then at the man who had been my North Star since I was 7 years old. I felt a surge of that silly, bright, wonderful joy that always lived in my chest. "Only if you promise one thing," I said, my voice trembling with a happy sort of giggle. "Anything," he vowed. "You have to promise that we'll never, ever be too old to climb this tree." Arthur smiled, leaned in, and kissed me. It tasted like sunshine and home. "Cross my heart," he whispered. "And hope to fly," I finished. And as the wind rustled through the leaves of our old apple tree, I knew that some promises aren't just words spoken in childhood. They are the seeds we plant that, with a little bit of patience and a lot of love, grow into the very shade we live under. I might never be the sort of grown-up who knows how to cook a souffle, but I knew exactly where I belonged. Right here in the mess and the mud and the beautiful, bright blossoms of a life shared with my oldest friend. The spiders in the shed would just have to get used to us. We weren't going anywhere. I looked at Arthur, and he looked at me, and we both burst out laughing for no reason at all, other than the fact that the sky was blue, the biscuits were crunchy, and we were finally, perfectly, home. "Right then," I said, wiping a tear of laughter from my eye. "Who's for tea? I think I haven't burnt the kettle in at least for days. That's a new record." Arthur took my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine, strong and warm. "Lead the way, Pops, lead the way." And so we walked back to the house, to people who had found the secret that the world often forgets, that growing up is optional, but growing together is the most wonderful adventure of all. The sun set behind the hills, leaving a trail of gold on the grass, and for the first time in a very long time, everything was exactly as it should be. The promise was kept, the healing was done, and the future, well, the future looked an awful lot like a lopsided treehouse and a garden full of tart apples, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Oh crumbs, life really was quite lovely, wasn't it? The kettle didn't just boil, it sang, or perhaps it was me humming under my breath as I danced a little jig across the linoleum, my whereupon socks sliding perfectly over the tiles. The kitchen in our cottage was a patchwork quilt of a room, filled with mismatched mugs, jars of homemade jam that leaned slightly to the left, and chairs that wobbled if you sat on them the wrong way. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that look, the one that made me feel like I was the only person in the entire world who mattered. "Poppy," he said, his voice like warm honey on a drizzly Devon afternoon, "the tea." Right, teed, mission accepted. I grabbed the teapot, the one shaped like a very fat hen, and plopped into tea bags. Do you think the hen minds having boiling water poured into her? But I should probably apologize. Sorry, Henrietta. Arthur chuckled, moving into the room to take the heavy kettle from my hand. His movements were slow, deliberate, a far cry from the frantic energy he'd brought home from London. I'll handle the boiling water. Pops, I'd quite like to keep all your toes intact for the wedding. The wedding, the word bounced around the room like a runaway balloon. It was a real thing now. Not a one day or a perhaps when the stars align sort of thing. But we're actually doing this thing. I looked down at the silver apple blossom on my finger. It caught the light from the overhead bulb, sparkling with a quiet, stubborn sort of hope. It wasn't flashy, but it was sturdy, just like the man who'd given it to me. A wedding, I whispered, the silliness momentarily replaced by a soft, glowing wonder. We'll need flowers, lots of them, and maybe a brass band, or just a very talented whistling gardener. Oh, Artie, do you think we can get a cake that tastes like sunshine? Let's start with the tea first, Arthur suggested, pouring the water with a steady hand. One step at a time. Remember, that's our new rule. No more rushing toward the finish line before we've even laced up our boots. He was right. One step, one breath, one cuppa. The next morning, Oakhaven was draped in a fine, silvery mist that made the ancient trees look like giants huddled together for a morning chat. I woke up before the sun, mostly because my feet were cold and partly because my heart was acting like a bouncy ball. I crept downstairs, my fleece-lined leggings making a soft swish-swish sound on the creaky wood. To my surprise, Arthur was already out in the garden. He was standing by the old apple tree, the one that held our lopsided, blue-painted sanctuary. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the branches with an expression of pure, unadulterated peace. I grabbed 2 woolly jumpers from the peg by the door, the ones with the slightly frayed sleeves, and scurried out to join him. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through my socks instantly, but I didn't care. "Ew, Chilly Willy," I squeaked, hopping from foot to foot as I reached him. "Here, put this on before you turn into a human icicle. I don't think I can marry an icicle. The ring would just slide right off, and then where would we be? Digging through the mulch, that's where." He smiled, taking the jumper, a garish, hand-wear-upon orange thing I'd made him last winter, and pulling it over his head. "Good morning, my little firecracker. Why are you up so early? I thought you were dreaming of biscuits." Couldn't stay in bed, I confessed, leaning my head against his arm. The world felt too big and too exciting. I kept thinking about the treehouse. Do you think we should put curtains in? Polka dots, maybe, or little bees with tiny hats? Arthur wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. He smelled like wood smoke and the fresh, sharp scent of the morning air. "Whatever you want, Pops, if you want bees in hats, we'll have bees in hats, but I think the spiders might charge them rent." We stood there for a long time, watching the mist slowly retreat as the sun began to peek over the rolling hills. It was a pale, watery sun, typical for a Devon autumn, but it felt warmer than any tropical heat wave. "I had a dream last night," Arthur said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "About the city. But for the first time, I wasn't running. I wasn't late for a meeting or losing a file. I was just leaving. I saw the tall buildings and the grey suits. And I just turned around and walked away. I came here, to the orchard, and you were there, holding a plate of very, very burnt toast." "Hey, my toast isn't always burnt," I protested, though we both knew that was a blatant lie. Sometimes it's just aggressively tanned. "It was the best toast I've ever seen," he said, kissing the top of my head. In the dream, I realized that I didn't miss the noise. I didn't miss the pressure or the feeling that I had to be perfect. I just missed being me, the me that used to climb trees and get mud on his knees and believe that anything was possible. Well, you've got plenty of mud now, I said, pointing to his boots, and I suspect there's a spider in your hair. But don't panic, he's probably just a local surveyor checking the property lines. Arthur didn't flinch. The old Arthur, the one who had returned from London with hollow eyes and a suitcase full of stress, would have spent 10 minutes scrubbing his hair. This Arthur just ruffled his locks and shrugged. Hope he likes the view, he muttered, a genuine grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Later that day, we decided to brave the village. Oakhaven wasn't a large place, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in sheer, unbridled curiosity. Everyone knew everyone's business, and everyone certainly knew that Arthur Finch had come home to stay with that quirky Miller girl in the cottage by the orchard. As we walked down the high street, which consisted of a bakery that smelled like heaven, a post office that smelled like old paper, and a pub called the Sleepy Badger, I felt like we were part of a parade. I waved at everyone, my yellow raincoat bobbing in the wind. Morning, Mr. Higgins. Lovely day for the petunias, or are they marigolds? I always get them muddled. Hello, Mrs. Gable. Did your hip stop clicking? Mine started a bit of a percussion solo today, quite rhythmic really. Arthur walked beside me, his pace slow and easy. He didn't seem to mind my constant chatter, or the way I stopped to pet every dog we passed, even the ones that looked a bit grumpy. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the spectacle, his hand never leaving mine. When we reached the post office, Mrs. Gable was waiting behind the counter with a look that suggested she had a very juicy piece of news. Her spectacles were perched on the very tip of her nose, and her grey bun was tighter than a snare drum. Morning, Poppy, morning, Arthur, she said, her eyes darting immediately to our joined hands. I see the orchard air is doing wonders for you both, although, Poppy, I did hear a rumour about a blue treehouse, a very vibrant blue treehouse. My cousin Mabel says she can see it from the top of the hill. I beamed, my chest puffing out with pride. It's summer sky blue, Mrs. Gable, or at least, that's what the tin said. It looks a bit more like shocked Smurf in the direct sunlight. But we like it. It's a landmark. People can use it to find their way home. Mrs. Gable huffed a little laugh, a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. Well, it's certainly visible. There's a parcel for you. Arthur came in on the morning van. Looks official. Heavy, too. I felt Arthur's hand tighten slightly in mine. Official. That usually meant lawyers, or banks, or things that made his face go pale and his jaw set in that hard, city line. My heart did a little nervous pitter-patter. Was the city trying to pull him back? Was there some unfinished business that was going to ruin our lopsided, blue treehouse life? Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Arthur said, his voice steady, though I could feel the tension radiating off him. She slid a thick, brown envelope across the counter. It was covered in stamps from a fancy London firm, the kind with too many names in the title. We walked out of the shop and sat on a wooden bench under the great oak tree in the square. The village green was quiet, save for a few pigeons squabbling over a crust of bread. Do you want me to open it? I asked, my voice small and uncharacteristically quiet. I'm very good at ripping things. I have a real talent for distraction when it comes to envelopes. I call it my confetti mode. Arthur looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he turned his head and looked at me. He saw my worried eyes, my slightly messy pigtails, and the way I was nervously kicking my heels against the bench legs. He took a deep breath, the kind that starts in your toes and fills your whole soul. No, he said, I'll do it. He tore it open. Inside was a stack of legal papers and a smaller, cream-coloured envelope. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing. I held my breath, feeling like a tiny mouse waiting for a cat to pounce. It's my final settlement, he said after what felt like an eternity. The firm is officially dissolved. They've sold the assets. This is the remainder of my share. It's over, Poppy. The last tie is cut. Is it a lot? I asked, tilting my head. Enough for a lifetime supply of chocolate biscuits, or maybe a small pond for the ducks. I think they'd like a swimming pool. Arthur looked at the figure on the page and then back at me. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face, the kind of grin he used to have when we were 10 and we'd just stolen a handful of cherries from the neighbor's garden. Pops, it's enough for a lifetime supply of biscuits, a new roof for the cottage, a pond for the ducks, and perhaps even a small, very friendly tractor. A tractor, I clapped my hands, nearly falling off the bench. We could name him Barnaby. We could drive him to the pub. Oh, imagine the look on Mr. Higgins' face if we rolled up on a tractor. But then Arthur's smile softened into something deeper, something more profound. He picked up the smaller, cream envelope. It was addressed to him in a neat, elegant hand. He opened it and read it silently. As he read, I saw the last lingering shadows of the city vanish from his eyes. "What is it?" I whispered. "It's a note from my old mentor," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He says he's glad I got out. He says he always knew I was a gardener at heart, not a shark. He told me to grow something beautiful for him, because he never had the courage to leave the grey behind. I felt a lump in my throat, a warm, prickly sensation. Oh, Arthur, that's ever so lovely. He's a wise man, your mentor. He is, Arthur agreed. He tapped the papers back into the envelope with a firm, decisive movement. It's the final chapter. Poppy, the city is gone. It doesn't own a single piece of my mind anymore. I'm just Arthur Finch of Oakhaven, and I have a Treehouse to finish. He stood up, pulled me to my feet, and spun me around right there on the village green. I squealed, my skirt flaring out like a bright flower, and for a moment, the whole world was just a blur of green grass and blue sky. "To the bakery," he shouted, sounding more like the boy I'd grown up with than ever before. "We're buying the biggest, silliest cake they have. We're celebrating freedom. And jam tarts," I added, breathless and giggling. "And those little gingerbread men with the grumpy faces, we'll give them names and then eat them. It'll be a gingerbread revolution." We marched into the bakery like conquerors. Mrs. Potts, the baker, was a woman who believed that extra butter was the solution to all of life's problems, a philosophy I wholeheartedly supported. She greeted us with a flowery grin and a twinkle in her eye. "What'll it be then? You too. You look like you've just discovered a pot of gold at the end of the lane." "Better than that, Mrs. Potts," Arthur said, pointing to a large, three-tiered cake decorated with sugar, roses, and a rather confused-looking icing swan on top. "We've discovered that we're exactly where we're supposed to be. We'll take that one." "The whole thing." Mrs. Potts blinked, her rolling pin pausing mid-air. "That's for the Women's Institute meeting tomorrow. They'll have my head if I sell their centerpiece." "I'll pay double," Arthur said, winking at me, "and I'll buy them 3 dozen chocolate eclairs to make up for it. No one can stay cross while eating an eclair. It's a scientific fact." Mrs. Potts couldn't resist a deal like that. 10 minutes later, we were walking back up the hill toward our cottage, Arthur carrying the massive cake box like it was a holy relic, and me carrying a bag of apology eclairs that I was desperately trying not to sample. The afternoon was spent in a wonderful, sugar-induced haze. We sat on the floor of the living room, using the low coffee table as our dining set, and ate cake for lunch. It was messy, and the swan's head fell off almost immediately, but it was the most delicious meal I'd ever had. "I think," I said, licking a smear of pink icing off my thumb, "that we should have a very silly wedding. No long, boring speeches about synergy or investment. No uncomfortable shoes that make your feet cry. Just us, and the trees, and maybe a few ducks if they promise to be on their best behavior." "Agreed," Arthur said, leaning back against the sofa with a contented sigh. "But I draw the line at the ducks being bridesmaids. They'll just eat the bouquets and quack during the vows." "True," I mused, tapping my chin. Perhaps they can be the security detail. They're very good at nipping ankles if people get out of line. We'll give them little bow ties. Oh, Artie, can you imagine? Bow tie ducks. As the days turned into weeks, the orchard became our entire world. We spent our mornings pruning the trees well. Arthur pruned with professional precision, and I mostly talked to the ladybirds and occasionally got my hair hopelessly tangled in a low-hanging branch. We spent our afternoons planning the grand garden we would plant in the spring, full of wild foxgloves and sunflowers that would grow taller than the house. Arthur was learning the art of being still. It was a hard lesson for a man who had been trained to move at the speed of light, but he was getting there. He would sit on the porch for hours, a mug of tea in his hand, just watching the clouds change shape. "Look, that one looks like a giant teapot with a leaky spout," I'd shout, pointing at a fluffy white mass. "And that one looks like your last batch of scones," he'd retort, nudging me with his shoulder, solid, dependable, and likely to cause a dent if dropped. "Rude," I'd giggle, though I knew he was right. My baking was more of a contact sport than a culinary art. One evening, as the first sharp frost of the season began to settle on the grass, turning the orchard into a sparkling wonderland, we were curled up on the sofa in front of the fireplace. The fire crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across the walls. I was busy trying to knit a scarf for the apple tree. It looked a bit cold, poor thing, while Arthur was reading a book on organic farming, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "Pops," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. I didn't look up. I had just dropped a stitch and was having a very serious, whispered argument with the yarn. "Don't you dare unravel, you naughty string. Are you ever sorry that you waited for me? That you stayed here in this little village, tending to everyone else's gardens while I was away being whatever I was in London?" I put down my knitting, which currently looked more like a lumpy sock than a scarf, and looked at him, truly looked at him. His face was filled out now, the sharp, gaunt lines of his cheeks replaced by a healthy, rustic glow. His eyes were no longer tired or haunted. They were full of the same light I'd seen when we were children, only deeper, wiser. "Arthur Finch," I said, my voice firm but soft. "I didn't wait because I had nothing better to do. I didn't stay here because I was afraid of the world. I stayed because this is where my heart lives, and I waited because there was nobody else I wanted to share my burnt toast with. Life isn't about the grand titles or the fancy flats. It's about the person who makes your soul feel like it's finally come home." I leaned over and poked him gently in the chest. "And you big silly goose, are that person. I'd wait another 20 years if I had to. But I'm quite glad I don't have to. Because my knitting skills aren't improving fast enough to keep us both in jumpers for that long." He caught my hand and kissed my palm, right where the silver ring sat. "I don't deserve you, Poppy Miller." "Bosh," I exclaimed, my eyes crinkling. "Of course you do. Who else would put up with my singing in the shower? I sound like a bag of cats being swung around by their tails, and you know it. You even hummed along this morning." "It's my favorite song," he whispered, pulling me closer. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional hiss of the fire. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full of all the things we didn't need to say anymore. The healing wasn't just about Arthur, it was about us. It was about realizing that the promises we make to ourselves are just as important as the ones we make to others. "I've been thinking about the wedding ceremony," Arthur said after a while, his chin resting on my head. "I want to plant a tree. Instead of just exchanging rings, we'll plant a new apple tree in the very center of the orchard. A promise tree, something that will grow alongside us, year after year." My eyes filled with tears, the happy, sparkly kind that make everything look like a dream. "Oh, Arthur, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Can we put a little fence around it so the rabbits don't eat it? I love rabbits." But they are terribly naughty and have no respect for symbolic botany. A very strong fence, he promised, a chuckle vibrating in his chest, and we'll use the soil from your garden and the soil from my family's old patch, a proper muddle of lives, joined together. A proper muddle, that was us. We were a bit messy, a bit lopsided, and entirely unconventional. But as I looked at the man beside me, I realized that we were also perfectly, wonderfully whole. The city had tried to break him, and the loneliness had tried to dampen me, but together, we were like two old trees that had grown our roots so deep and so intertwined that no storm in the world could ever knock us down. I love you, Pops, he said. I love you more, Artie, I replied, yawning as the warmth of the fire began to pull at my eyelids. And tomorrow, I'm going to try and make scones again, real ones, without using a hammer to break them open. Arthur laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the quiet cottage. I'll have the fire extinguisher ready, just in case. Rude, I giggled, but I didn't mind. Because in our little corner of Devon, among the apple trees and the blue-painted wood, every mistake was just another story to tell, and every day was a promise kept. The night deepened, the frost turning the world outside into a sparkling, silent wonderland. Inside, the fire burned low, and two hearts, once lost in the noise of the world, beat in perfect, quiet rhythm. We weren't just growing up anymore, we were blooming. And oh, what a lovely thing it was to finally be in season. As I drifted off to sleep, my head on his shoulder and the smell of wood smoke in my hair, I had one final, very important thought. I really must remember to buy more blue paint. The garden shed was looking a bit jealous of the treehouse, and it wouldn't do to have a grumpy shed on our wedding day, now would it? Life was silly, life was sweet, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just waiting for the future to happen. I was living right in the middle of it, and it tasted exactly like apple blossoms and home. The next morning, the smell of wood smoke was replaced by the scent of something. Definitely toasted, I woke up to the sound of Arthur in the kitchen. He was whistling a jaunty, slightly off-key tune that made my heart do its customary somersault. I hopped out of bed, threw on my oversized cardigan that was missing two buttons, and dashed downstairs. Is something on fire? I asked, poking my head around the kitchen door. Arthur was standing at the stove, a spatula in one hand and a look of intense concentration on his face. I'm making pancakes, or at least, I'm making things that look like pancakes. They might be a bit more like rubber frisbees at the moment, but they're edible. I walked over and peered into the pan. They look magnificent. Look at that one. It's shaped like a heart or a very lumpy potato. Either way, it's a masterpiece of modern breakfast art. He flipped a pancake. It landed half on and half off the plate with a soft splat. We both stared at it for a second before bursting into laughter. Perfect, he said, sliding the lumpy potato heart onto my plate, just like us. I took a bite. It was a bit doughy in the middle and slightly charred on the edges, tasting faintly of vanilla and smoke. It was, without a doubt, the best thing I had ever tasted. Artie, I said through a mouthful of pancake. Yes, Pops. I think we're going to be very good at this happily ever after business, even if we never quite figure out how to use the toaster properly. He smiled, leaning across the table to wipe a smudge of flour off the tip of my nose. I think you're right, Poppy. I think you're absolutely right. And as the sun rose over Oakhaven, casting long, golden shadows across the orchard, I knew that the boy who tried to climb the tree and the girl who talked to ducks had finally found exactly what they were looking for. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves. The blue treehouse stood tall in the garden, a beacon of silliness and strength. The apples were tart, the tea was strong, and the promise that old, golden thread had finally woven itself into the very fabric of our lives. Right then, I said, finishing my pancake and standing up with a determined look. Today is the day. We are going to find the perfect spot for the promise tree, and then we are going to see if we can teach the ducks to hum 'Here Comes the Bride.' I've got a bag of crusts for bribes." Arthur stood up, took my hand, and followed me out into the bright, beautiful morning. "Lead the way, Pops, lead the way." The grass was cold, the air was crisp, and the world was wide and wonderful. And as we walked through the orchard, hand in hand, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together, one lopsided, beautiful, perfectly imperfect step at a time. Oh crumbs, life really was quite lovely, wasn't it? The shovel was far heavier than it looked, or perhaps my arms were simply more accustomed to holding teacups and sketchbooks than doing actual, honest-to-goodness manual labor. Arthur, of course, looked far too comfortable with a spade in his hand. He had that annoying way of looking rugged and dependable even when he was covered in streaks of Devon mud and wearing a jumper that had definitely seen better decades. "You're holding it like a giant spoon, Poppy," he remarked, leaning on his own shovel and watching me struggle with a particularly stubborn patch of turf. "It is a giant spoon," I retorted, pausing to wipe a smudge of dirt from my forehead with the back of my hand, only to realize I'd probably just made things worse. "I am spooning the earth to make a bed for our tree. It's a very delicate, romantic process. Arthur, you wouldn't understand. You're just digging." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to harmonize with the rustle of the dry leaves. "Right, sorry, my apologies to the earth. Please, continue your horticultural romance." We were standing at the very edge of the orchard, where the cultivated apple trees gave way to a wilder, more tangled stretch of land that sloped down toward the stream. This was the spot. It had a view of the blue treehouse, the old stone wall, and, if you squinted just right, the distant, purple-hued peaks of the moors. It was the perfect place for a promise tree. The sapling was a young rowan, its branches slender and tipped with the promise of bright red berries. My grandmother used to say rowans were trees of protection and inspiration, and since we were planning on doing a lot of living and a fair bit of dreaming here, it felt only right. Right then, Arthur said, stepping in to help as I hit a particularly large rock. "Let the professional handle the heavy lifting. You go and prepare whatever it is you do to make trees feel welcome." "I shall fetch the ceremonial water," I announced with a flourish, "and perhaps a biscuit. Trees like snacks too, I imagine." I trotted back toward the cottage, my wellies making a satisfying squelch-pop sound in the damp grass. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes your nose tingle and your breath come out in little puffs of dragon smoke. Everything felt so incredibly real. For years, I had lived in a world of maybes and someday soons, but here I was, actually planting a tree with the boy who had once promised to catch the moon for me if I asked nicely enough. In the kitchen, I filled a vintage watering can, the one with the faded daisies painted on the side, and grabbed a tin of shortbread. I also grabbed my secret weapon, a small, weathered tin box I'd found in the attic. When I returned, Arthur had finished the hole. It was deep and neat, a perfect circle in the dark, rich soil. He looked up as I approached, his hair a mess and his cheeks flushed from the exertion. "Is that the ceremonial water?" he asked, nodding toward the can. "It is, and this," I said, holding up the tin box, "is the most important part." He frowned curiously. "What's in there?" "Promises," I said simply. I sat down on a flat stone, ignoring the dampness seeping into my trousers. I opened the tin. Inside were scraps of paper, some yellowed with age, others fresh and white. I've been writing them down, things I want us to remember, things I want this tree to hold onto for us while we're busy being adults. Arthur sat down beside me, his shoulder pressing against mine. "Read one." I picked up a tiny, folded square. "This one is from when I was 7. It says, 'I promise to always share my sweets with Arthur, even the red ones.'" Arthur laughed. You definitely broke that one. I remember a very distinct incident involving a bag of gummy bears in 2012. Hush, you, it's the thought that counts, and this one is new, I said, my voice softening. It says I promise to never let the blue paint fade, not on the treehouse, and not on the way we look at the world. Arthur took the tin from my hand, his fingers grazing mine. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at the little scraps of paper, our history, our silly little dreams, our tiny, quiet vows. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin. My granddad gave me this, he said. He told me to keep it for a rainy day, but I think I'd rather bury it here, to give the tree a bit of silver to grow on, a bit of luck. We placed the tin and the coin at the bottom of the hole. Then, together, we lowered the rowan sapling into the earth. We took turns shoveling the soil back in, patting it down firmly but gently, as if we were tucking a child into bed. There I whispered, giving the trunk a little pat, "Grow well, little tree, you've got a lot of work to do." Now, about those ducks, Arthur said, standing up and brushing the dirt from his knees, I believe you mentioned something about a choir. Oh, yes, the Oakhaven duck corral. I jumped up, my energy returning instantly. I've been observing them. There's a mallard with a very distinctive quack. I call him Barnaby, who I'm convinced has perfect pitch, or at least, he's very loud. Which is half the battle in musical theatre. We marched down to the pond, the bag of bread crusts rustling in my pocket. The ducks were already congregating, sensing a potential windfall. Barnaby was there, looking particularly dapper with his iridescent green head shimmering in the afternoon light. Right, listen up. Everyone, I shouted, clapping my hands. The ducks stared at me with their bead-like eyes, tilting their heads in that skeptical way ducks have. We are here to rehearse for a very important event. There will be crusts. There will be glory. Now, after 3, a 1, a 2, a 3. I began to hum the first few bars of Here Comes the Bride, swaying slightly from side to side. Arthur stood behind me, trying and failing to keep a straight face. Quack, said Barnaby. No, Barnaby. It's more of a mm8mm8mm8mm, I corrected, waving a piece of crust like a conductor's baton. Quack, quack, he replied, more insistently this time. He's telling you you're in the wrong key, Arthur suggested, his shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. He's a baritone. Clearly, you're pushing him into the tenor range. Oh, don't be ridiculous. He's just warming up. I tossed a piece of bread to a smaller duck near the edge. You there, Mrs. Puddleduke. You have the look of a soprano. Join in. Within minutes, the pond was a chaos of splashing, quacking, and flapping wings. It wasn't exactly a choir. It was more like a very enthusiastic, very hungry riot. I stood in the middle of it all, laughing so hard I nearly fell into the reeds, throwing crusts in every direction. They're terrible, I gasped, leaning against Arthur for support. They have no sense of rhythm whatsoever. The wedding is going to be a disaster. Arthur wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me close. I don't know. I think Riot at the Pond is a very avant-garde choice for a wedding march. Very modern, very us. You're right, I said, catching my breath. Who wants a boring organ anyway? We'll have the sound of hungry mallards. It'll be the talk of the village. We stood there for a while, watching the ducks settle back into their usual routine of floating aimlessly and looking for bugs. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and bruised plum. We should probably head into the village, Arthur said softly. Before the hardware shop closes, we have a very important mission. The blue paint, I remembered, my eyes brightening. Yes, we must find the perfect shade, not too dark, or it'll look like a thunderstorm, not too light, or it'll look like a baby's nursery. It needs to be hopeful blue. Hopeful blue, got it. We walked back to the cottage to wash the mud off our hands and change into slightly more respectable clothes. I swapped my cardigan for a thick woolen coat and wound a long, whereupon scarf 3 times around my neck. Arthur found his car keys a minor miracle in itself, and we piled into his old, slightly battered Land Rover. The drive to the village was short but beautiful. The lanes were narrow, hemmed in by high stone walls and ancient hedgerows that were now skeletal and grey against the twilight. We passed the old stone bridge where we used to play poo sticks, and the gate where Arthur had once fallen off his bike trying to impress me with a no-hands trick. Every corner of this place held a ghost of who we used to be, but they weren't haunting ghosts, they were friendly ones, waving us on. The village of Oakhaven was exactly what you'd expect from a Devon hamlet. A cluster of cob and thatch cottages, a tiny post office that also sold wool and tinned peas, and the pub, the Rusty Anchor, which was currently glowing with the warm, amber light of a log fire. The hardware shop, Henderson and Sons, was tucked away in a corner of the square. It was the kind of shop that smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and old metal. Mr. Henderson, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a very sturdy piece of oak, was behind the counter, polishing a brass door knocker. "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson," I chirped, the bell above the door still jangling behind us. He looked up, his spectacles perched on the very tip of his nose, Poppy Thorne, and Arthur Penhilligan. "Back again, are you? I heard you were lurking about the old cottage." "We're not lurking," I said indignantly. "We're residing. There's a very big difference." HMPH sounds like lurking to me. He gave us a small, rare smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "What can I do for you then? Come to buy more of those light bulbs you keep blowing." "Paint," Arthur said, stepping forward. "We need blue paint, a very specific blue." Mr. Henderson led us to the back of the shop, where tins of paint were stacked in towering, precarious piles. "Blue, eh? I've got midnight. I've got navy. I've got duck egg. Though why anyone would want their house to look like an egg is beyond me." I shook my head. No, it needs to be brighter, like the sky just after a rainstorm, or the colour of a very happy bluebell. Mr. Henderson sighed, a long, dramatic sound. "You always were a difficult one, Poppy, always wanted the colours that don't come in a tin." He rummaged around in the back for a few minutes, clanking tins and muttering under his breath about young people and their fancies. Finally, he emerged with a dusty, unlabelled tin. "Found this in the storeroom. Someone ordered it years ago and never picked it up. Cornflower, they called it. It's got a bit of a glow to it." He pried open the lid with a screwdriver. I leaned in, holding my breath. It was perfect. It wasn't just blue. It was a vibrant, singing shade that seemed to hold its own light. It was the colour of summer mornings and secret promises. It was the colour of the treehouse. "That's it," I whispered. "That's hopeful blue." "I'll take to tins," Arthur said, reaching for his wallet. As we walked back out into the cool evening air, the tins of paint heavy in Arthur's hands, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It was just paint, really, just pigment and oil in a metal can. But it felt like we were buying the future. We were buying the means to keep our world bright, even when the Devon winters tried to turn everything grey. The village square was quiet now. A few people were heading into the pub, their laughter muffled by the heavy oak door. The stars were beginning to prick through the velvet sky, sharp and cold. "Are you hungry?" Arthur asked. As we reached the car, "We could go into the Anchor for a bit of pie. Mrs. Gable's steak and ale is legendary." "Oh, definitely hungry." But I hesitated, looking back toward the cottage, which was just a dark silhouette on the hill. "Could we just go home? I want to see the orchard in the starlight, and I think I've had enough excitement for one day. Teaching ducks to sing is surprisingly draining." Arthur smiled, that soft, knowing smile that always made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "Home it is." The drive back was quiet. I rested my head against the window, watching the moon rise over the fields. My mind was drifting, wandering through the rooms of our lives. I thought about the treehouse, the promise tree, the blue paint, and the ducks. I thought about the way Arthur's hand felt in mine, steady and warm. When we got back to the cottage, the house felt welcoming, even in the dark. It had that scent of old wood and dried lavender that I'd come to associate with safety. Arthur set the paint tins down in the hallway, and I headed straight for the kitchen to put the kettle on. "Arthur," I called out as the water began to hiss. Yet he appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. I was thinking about the wedding. He went still, his expression unreadable. "What about it?" "I don't want a big thing. No fancy hotels or white marquees. I want it here, in the orchard, under the rowan tree, even if it is just a twig by then. I want everyone to wear their wellies and eat sandwiches on the grass. And I want the ducks to be there, even if they don't sing." Arthur walked over to me, taking the teapot out of my hands and setting it down. He took both of my hands in his eyes searching mine. "Poppy," he said, his voice low and serious, "I would marry you in the middle of a muddy field in a rainstorm, if that's what you wanted. I'd marry you in a hardware shop. I'd marry you tomorrow if I thought you'd say yes." My heart did that silly little somersault again. Tomorrow might be a bit soon. I haven't found a dress that goes with my yellow wellies yet. He laughed, pulling me into a hug. "You're a nightmare, you know that." "Yes," I whispered into his chest, "but I'm your nightmare." "Always," he replied. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other in the quiet kitchen. The kettle boiled and clicked off, the steam rising in a gentle plume. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane and whispering through the apple trees. Later that night, after we'd had our tea and finished the biscuits, I sat by the fire with my sketchbook. I didn't draw the trees or the cottage. Instead, I drew a tiny, blue-painted shed with a crooked roof and a sign that said the Promise Tree Nursery. Life wasn't perfect. There were still holes in the roof. The ducks were tone deaf, and I was fairly certain I had a permanent smudge of mud on my nose. But as I looked at Arthur, who was fast asleep in the armchair with a book on his lap, I knew that perfection was overrated. We were building something real, something messy and lopsided and beautiful. We were two people who had spent a long time waiting for the world to make sense, only to realize that we were the ones who had to make sense of the world. I reached out and tucked the blanket closer around Arthur's legs. He stirred slightly, a faint smile touching his lips, but he didn't wake up. I looked at the blue paint tins sitting in the hallway. Tomorrow, we would start painting. Tomorrow, the world would be a little bit more hopeful blue. And the day after that, we might just try to teach the cows to dance. After all, as I'd learned in Oakhaven, anything is possible if you have enough bread crusts and someone to hold your hand. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes and listening to the rhythmic breathing of the man I loved and the quiet crackle of the fire. The promise wasn't just a word anymore. It was the air I breathed. It was the ground beneath my feet. It was the way the light hit the orchard in the morning. "Wait for me," I whispered to the empty room, or perhaps to the future itself. "I'm almost there. We're almost there." And as the last embers of the fire faded into glowing red coals, I fell asleep dreaming of bluebells, rowan berries, and a life that was finally, wonderfully, in season. The morning arrived with a sky the color of a pale primrose and the enthusiastic, if somewhat tuneless, quacking of the ducks outside the kitchen window. I woke up with a strand of hair stuck to my cheek and the distinct feeling that today was going to be a very important day for fences and sheds, and possibly my left thumb, which I was almost certain to hit with a hammer at some point. Arthur was already up. I could hear the clinking of porcelain from downstairs, the unmistakable song of a man making a proper English breakfast. I scrambled out of bed, threw on my thickest woolen jumper, the one with the slightly frayed elbows that smelled like wood smoke, and hurried down the creaky stairs. "Morning, sleepyhead," Arthur said, not looking up from the frying pan. He was wearing an apron over his flannel shirt, a sight that always made me want to giggle and squeeze him at the same time. It had a picture of a very grumpy-looking owl on it that said, "Who's hungry?" Is that bacon I smell, or have I finally died and gone to the great deli in the sky? I asked, hopping onto a stool at the breakfast bar. Bacon, eggs, and toast, he confirmed, sliding a plate toward me. We need our strength. The blue paint isn't going to jump onto the shed by itself, Poppy, though with your luck. You'll probably end up covered in it anyway. It's an artistic choice, I said, pointing a fork at him. I like to wear my progress. We ate quickly, the kitchen filled with the golden light of a Cotswold morning. There was something so settled about us now. The frantic, aching uncertainty of our younger years had been replaced by this quiet, sturdy rhythm. We were like two old boots that had finally found their match, comfortable and broken in all the right places. Once the plates were cleared, we marched out to the garden like a two-person army. The Promise Tree Nursery, which was currently just a dilapidated garden shed with a serious leaning problem, stood at the edge of the orchard. It looked a bit sad in the morning light, its old brown paint peeling away like sunburnt skin. Right, Arthur said, cracking his knuckles. Sand first, paint second, no crying if we get a splinter. I don't cry at splinters, I huffed, grabbing a block of sandpaper. I just express my emotions loudly. We worked in a comfortable rhythm. The rasp-rasp-rasp of the sandpaper against the wood became a sort of percussion to the morning. I thought about all the things this shed would hold. Tiny saplings, terracotta pots, bags of rich, dark earth, and perhaps a jar of lemon drops hidden on a high shelf for when the gardening got too tough. It wasn't just a shed, it was a promise in the shape of a box. By noon, my arms were aching and I had sawdust in my eyelashes. Arthur looked remarkably clean, which I found deeply suspicious. How do you do that? I asked, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. You look like a DIY advert. I look like I've been rolled in a biscuit tin. He laughed, reaching out to brush a speck of dust off my nose. It's a gift, Poppy. Now, are you ready for the hopeful blue? I pried open the lid of the first tin. The colour was even more beautiful than it had looked in the shop. It was the colour of a summer sky just before the stars come out. It was the colour of forget-me-nots and the shadows on snow. It's perfect, I whispered. I dipped my brush in and made the first stroke. The blue stood out vividly against the greyed wood. It felt like we were reclaiming the shed from the shadows, giving it a new reason to stand tall. As we painted, our conversation drifted, as it often did, back to the village. Mrs. Higgins asked me when the big day was, Arthur said, his brush moving in long, steady lines. She saw us at the hardware shop and told the entire post office that we were planning an extravagant gala. I nearly dropped my brush. An extravagant gala. I'm wearing wellies. I told her I wanted sandwiches on the grass. You know, Mrs. Higgins, Arthur chuckled. To her, a sandwich with the crusts cut off is a royal banquet. She's already offered to knit us a celebratory tea cozy. Oh, blimey, what colour? Neon orange, apparently, to brighten up the parlour. I sighed, but I couldn't stop smiling. I love this place. I love that the postmistress knows our business before we do. I love that the ducks think they're the welcoming committee. It's also messy and wonderful. It's home, Arthur said softly. We finished the first coat just as the sun began to dip behind the row of ancient oaks that bordered the property. The shed was transformed. It glowed in the twilight, a vibrant, defiant blue against the green of the orchard. It looks like a dream, I said, leaning my head on Arthur's shoulder. It looks like a shed, Poppy, but a very, very hopeful one. We spent the evening sitting on the back porch, our legs dangling over the edge, watching the stars flicker into existence. My hands were indeed stained blue, my cuticles, my palms even a little smudge on my chin. I looked like I'd been wrestling a smurf. Arthur, I said, watching a bat swoop low over the grass. HMM. Do you remember when we were 10, under the old rowan tree at the edge of the school field? You told me to wait for you. You said you were going to go and conquer the world, and then come back and build me a castle. Arthur went quiet for a moment. I could see his profile in the moonlight, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he looked out at the trees. I remember I thought I had to be a hero. I thought I had to have a chest full of medals and a bank account full of gold to be worth your time. And he turned to look at me, his eyes dark and full of a tenderness that made my breath catch. And now I realize that the castle is a blue shed with a leaky roof, and the conquering was just finding my way back to the girl who used to share her jam sandwiches with me. I missed you every day, I admitted, my voice small. Even when I was angry at you for leaving, even when I told myself I'd forgotten what your laugh sounded like, I was always waiting. I was just growing up in the meantime. You did a good job of it, he said, taking my blue-stained hand in his. Growing up? I mean, you didn't lose the magic, Poppy. Most people do. They get all grey and serious and forget how to talk to ducks. But you stayed bright. I had to, I said, looking down at our joined hands. If I didn't stay bright, how would you have found your way back in the dark? He squeezed my hand. Good point. The next few days were a whirlwind of Oakhaven magic. News of our extravagant gala had spread like wildfire. Mr. Henderson from the dairy turned up on Tuesday with a crate of glass-bottled milk and a slightly bruised apple for the ducks. Here you're getting hitched in the orchard, he said, tipping his flat cap. Bold choice. Watch out for the mud. My Bessie, that's the cow with the white ear, she gets a bit frisky when she hears music. Might try to join the dance floor. The more the merrier, Mr. Henderson, I said, beaming. I've always wanted a cow as a bridesmaid. She's a bit heavy on the toes, he warned, but she's got a heart of gold. Then there was Miss Penelope from the flower shop, who arrived with a bundle of dried lavender and a look of fierce determination. No white lilies, she declared, let herself into the garden. Too stiff. You need wild things. Cornflowers. Daisies. A bit of ivy to show you're stuck together for good. I'll bring the buckets on the morning of. Don't you dare buy any of those plastic-wrapped things from the supermarket. Arthur Pendergast, or I'll have your head. Arthur just nodded meekly. No one argued with Miss Penelope. It felt as though the entire village was weaving itself into our story. Every person who stopped by left a little bit of their own warmth behind. It wasn't just my and Arthur's wedding. It was a celebration of the fact that Oakhaven looked after its own. One afternoon, while Arthur was busy fixing the fence near the stream, I went out to the rowan tree. It was still small, more of a sapling than a majestic tree, but its leaves were a vibrant, healthy green. I knelt down in the grass, the damp earth soaking into the knees of my trousers. You've got a big job ahead of you, I whispered to the tree. You have to be the witness. You have to remember the vows we're going to say. You have to grow tall so that one day our children can climb you and look out over the world we build. I felt a bit silly talking to a tree, but then I remembered where I was, in Oakhaven. The trees probably listened. The wind certainly did. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of blue ribbon the same color as the paint on the shed. I tied it gently around one of the lower branches. A marker. A sign that this spot was sacred. Poppy, Arthur's voice called out from across the field. I stood up, brushing the grass from my knees. He was standing by the stream, the sun behind him, casting a long golden shadow. He looked like the hero he'd always wanted to be, even without the medals. Coming, I shouted back. As I ran toward him, I didn't feel like the clumsy girl who was always tripping over her own feet. I felt light. I felt like I was exactly the right age, in exactly the right place. We spent the rest of the afternoon training the ducks. It mostly involved me whistling and Arthur throwing small bits of bread in a specific direction to see if they would walk in a straight line. "They're not going to be a processional, Poppy," Arthur said, watching as a mallard named Barnaby decided to sit down and preen his feathers right in the middle of our aisle. "They just need a bit of motivation," I insisted. "Barnaby, feet up, think of the dignity of the occasion." Barnaby let out a loud, flatulent-sounding quack and turned his back on us. "See," Arthur said, grinning, "total anarchy. It's going to be a disaster." "A beautiful disaster," I corrected him, "the best kind." That night, we sat in the kitchen, surrounded by lists and sketches, and a very confusing map Miss Penelope had drawn showing where the floral installation should go. "Are you happy, Poppy?" Arthur asked suddenly. He was looking at me with an intensity that always made my heart skip a beat. I looked around our kitchen. I looked at the blue paint under my fingernails, the muddy wellies by the door, the kettle that whistled just a little too loudly, and the man who had waited half a lifetime to come home to me. "I'm more than happy," I said, and for once, the words didn't feel big enough. I found like I was a puzzle piece that had been under the sofa for 20 years, and someone finally picked me up and put me back where I belong. Arthur leaned across the table and kissed me. He tasted like tea and ginger biscuits and the future. "I'm never letting you get lost under the sofa again," he promised. I laughed, leaning my head against his. "Good, because it's very dusty down there." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a slow, steady sound, a reminder that time was no longer our enemy. We didn't have to hurry anymore. We didn't have to worry about the years slipping away, because we were going to spend all of them together. I found the dress. I whispered into the quiet. Arthur pulled back, his eyes widening. "You did, when?" "Yesterday. When I went into town to get the extra brushes. It was in that little vintage shop behind the church. It's not white. It's more of a cream color like the froth on a latte. And it has these tiny embroidered daisies on the hem." "Does it go with the wellies?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. "Perfectly," I said. "It's just short enough that everyone will see the bright yellow rubber. I'll look like a very confused bride who got lost on her way to a farm." "You'll look beautiful," he said, and I knew he meant it. To Arthur, I was beautiful when I was covered in paint, when I was crying over a burnt loaf of bread, or when I was shouting at the ducks. He saw me through a lens of such pure affection that I sometimes felt like I was glowing. As the days crept closer to the wedding, the orchard began to change. The apple trees were heavy with fruit, the red and green globes hanging like ornaments. The air smelled of cider and ripening blackberries. It was the height of late summer, that golden, bittersweet time when the world seems to hold its breath before the first frost. We spent our evenings finishing the Promise Tree nursery. We hung a small wooden sign over the door, the letters carved by Arthur and painted by me. Inside, it was neat and organized, a place for things to grow. "It's the first building of our empire," I joked, standing back to admire the blue walls. "An empire of saplings and mud," Arthur agreed, wrapping an arm around my waist. I wouldn't have it any other way. One evening, a week before the ceremony, we went for a walk down to the village. The air was cool, and the smoke from the cottage chimneys drifted lazily into the sky. We passed the Green Man pub, where a group of old men were sitting outside with their pints. "Evenin', Arthur, evenin', Poppy," they called out in unison. "Evenin', lads," Arthur replied, waving. "Don't forget the cider for the wedding, boy," one of them shouted. "We won't toast you with water." "I've got 3 barrels coming from the orchard down the road," Arthur shouted back. The men cheered, and I felt a surge of pride. This was our world. These were our people. As we walked back up the hill toward our cottage, I looked at the silhouette of our home against the deepening purple of the sky. The hopeful blue shed was a dark square against the trees, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, a solid, tangible reminder of the work we'd put in. "Arthur," I said, stopping in the middle of the lane. I'm glad we waited. I'm glad we didn't try to do this when we were 18. We would have messed it up. We would have been too busy trying to be adults to actually enjoy being together." Arthur nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We needed to see the rest of the world to realize that this was the only part of it that mattered. We needed to get a few scars so we could appreciate how lucky we are to be whole." I reached up and touched his face. "I love your scars, Arthur Pendergast. And I love your blue fingers, Poppy Thorn." We stood there in the middle of the road, to people who had finally stopped running. The promise wasn't a weight anymore. It wasn't a chain that bound us to the past. It was a bridge, a sturdy, blue-painted bridge that led straight into the morning. And as we walked the last few yards to our front door, the first star appeared in the sky, right above the rowan tree. It was bright and steady, a little spark of light in the vast, darkening blue. "Make a wish," Arthur whispered. I looked at the star, then at the cottage, and finally at the man standing beside me. I closed my eyes and felt the cool night air on my skin. "I don't need to," I said, opening my eyes and smiling. "It's already come true." Inside the cottage, the fire was waiting to be lit, the kettle was waiting to be boiled, and the life we had promised each other was waiting to begin. And as the door clicked shut behind us, I knew that no matter what the future held, whether the roof leaked or the ducks never learned to sing, we were ready. We were grown up. We were home. The morning of the wedding arrived not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the soft, insistent rhythmic tapping of a robin against the window pane of the cottage. I woke up to the smell of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of overripe plums. For a moment, I stayed under the heavy woolen duvet, watching the way the dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sunlight that pierced through the gaps in the curtains. It was a silver-blue sort of morning, the kind that promised heat later on but held a crisp, autumnal secret in its lungs. "Today," I whispered to the empty room, "today is the day Poppy Thorn becomes Poppy Pendergast." I giggled, a bubbly, fizzy sound that felt like drinking ginger beer to fast. It was a ridiculous name. Really, it sounded like a character from a children's book about a girl who lives in a teapot. But as I threw back the covers and my bare feet hit the cold floorboards, I realized I wouldn't trade that ridiculous name for all the titles in London. Downstairs, the house was already a hive of quiet, rustic chaos. Mrs. Higgins from 3 doors down had arrived at the crack of dawn, bringing with her 4 different types of jam and a determination to see my hair tamed. She was currently in the kitchen, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a sea shanty while she polished the silver spoons. "Drink your tea, Poppy," she commanded as I wandered into the kitchen, looking like a haystack that had been hit by a light gale. "And don't you dare go near those ducks until you're in your dress. I saw that big white one, Barnaby, eyeing up your wellies. He's got mischief in his beak today." I took the mug of steaming Earl Grey, the warmth seeping into my fingers. "He's just excited for the cider, Mrs. Higgins. Arthur says he's been trying to peck at the barrels all night." "Ducks and weddings don't mix," she grumbled, though her eyes were twinkling. "Now, get along. Arthur's been up since 4, pacing the orchard like a man waiting for a bus that's 10 years late." I smiled into my tea. 10 years late, or perhaps exactly on time. The transformation took ours. Not because I wanted to look like a princess I wouldn't know how to do that even if someone gave me a manual, but because every time we tried to pin my hair up, a strand would escape, as if my head were staging a small rebellion. Eventually, we settled on a loose braid, woven through with tiny sprigs of dried lavender and the smallest, palest daisies I could find in the meadow. Then came the dress. It was exactly as I'd described to Arthur, cream-coloured, soft as a cloud, with those delicate embroidered flowers around the hem. It felt light, like I was wearing a memory. And, of course, the piece de resistance, the bright yellow Wellington boots. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror of the wardrobe. I didn't look like a high-fashion bride. I looked like me, a bit messy, a bit bright, and entirely ready to walk through a bit of mud to get to the man I loved. You look like a poppy, Mrs. Higgins said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that smelled of lavender and peppermint. Arthur won't know what hit him, probably a stray duck, knowing this lot, but he'll be happy nonetheless. The ceremony was held in the heart of the orchard, right beneath the oldest apple tree. We didn't have a carpet, we had a path of fallen leaves and crushed grass. We didn't have an organ, we had a local lad named Toby playing a slightly out-of-tune fiddle, and the distant, rhythmic lowing of a cow in the next field. As I walked down the aisle, which was really just the space between the rows of Bramley apples, I saw the village had turned out in force. There were the men from the Green Man, wearing their best waistcoats and smelling faintly of tobacco and hops. There were the school children, their faces smudged with berry juice, holding little bunches of wild flowers. And then there was Arthur. He was standing by the tree, wearing a tweed suit that looked slightly too warm for the sun, his hair windswept and his expression one of absolute, terrifying devotion. When he saw me yellow wellies, and all his face broke into a grin so wide and genuine that I felt my knees go a bit wobbly. He looked like the boy who used to share his sandwiches with me, and the man who had built me a nursery for my dreams. When I finally reached him, he took my hands. His palms were rough from the wood and the soil, and they felt like home. "You're wearing the boots," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I would," I whispered back. "I have to be prepared for the puddles, Arthur. Life is full of them." The vows we exchanged weren't the standard ones. We'd written them on the back of old seed packets the night before, sitting by the fire. "I promise," Arthur began, his voice steadying, "to always check the shed for spiders before you go in. I promise to never complain when the kitchen is full of half-finished paintings. And to always be the one who goes out in the rain to lock the coop. I promise to grow old with you, Poppy. But I also promise to never let us grow up so much that we forget how to climb trees." There was a collective awe from the village ladies, and I felt a tear prick at my eye. "I promise," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "to try and not burn the bread. Though I make no guarantees, I promise to keep your heart as safe as the first sapling in our nursery. I promise to be the person who laughs at your jokes even when they're terrible. And to walk beside you. Whether the path is paved or full of mud, I waited a long time to find my way back to this orchard. Arthur, I'm not going anywhere ever again." When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, the applause wasn't just a polite clapping. It was a roar. It was the sound of a community celebrating a story that had been written over 20 years. Arthur leaned in and kissed me, and for a moment, the world disappeared. There was no orchard, no village, no wellies. There was just the scent of pine and the feeling of a promise finally, beautifully kept. The reception was a blur of golden light and cider. We had long wooden tables set out under the trees, sagging under the weight of pork pies, scones, clotted cream, and great wheels of local cheese. The Green Man regulars had indeed brought the barrels, and the cider flowed like a golden river. Barnaby the duck did, in fact, managed to steal a piece of wedding cake, leading to a high-speed chase through the orchard involving 3 small children and a very determined Mrs. Higgins. We laughed until our sides ached. We danced on the grass, my yellow wellies thumping rhythmically against the earth as Toby the fiddler played faster and faster. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Arthur led me away from the noise. We walked hand in hand toward the Promise Tree nursery. The blue paint of the shed seemed to glow in the twilight, a beacon of hope in the gathering dark. We stepped inside. It was quiet here, the air cool and smelling of damp compost and new life. The rows of saplings stood in their pots, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. "Look at them," Arthur said, gesturing to the small trees. By the time we're old and grey, these will be a forest. People will walk through them and have no idea that they started as a promise between two people who were once very lost. I leaned my head against his shoulder. They're our empire, Arthur, just like I said. The Pendergast Empire, he joked, kissing the top of my head, specializing in mud, apples, and very stubborn painters. We stood there for a long time, watching the first few stars blink into existence through the nursery's glass roof. The frantic energy of the day had settled into a deep, buzzing contentment. I thought about the girl I had been in London, the girl who was always looking at her watch, always worrying about the next deadline, always feeling like there was a hole in her heart that no amount of success could fill. She felt like a stranger now, a distant cousin I hadn't seen in years. "Poppy," Arthur asked softly. Are you happy? Really happy? Not just wedding day happy, but this is my life happy?" I turned to him, taking in the smudge of dirt on his cheek and the way his eyes held the reflection of the stars. I thought about our leaky roof, the ducks that wouldn't listen, the hard work of the seasons, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the countryside. I thought about the blue shed and the way it stood as a testament to starting over. "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm so happy it almost scares me. But then I remember that we built this. It's not a fairy tale that just happened to us. We chose the wood, we painted the walls. And we planted the seeds. It's real, and because it's real, it's better than any dream I ever had." He pulled me into a hug, a proper, bone-crushing Arthur hug that smelled of wool and wood smoke. Good, because I've got a lot more seeds to plant, and I'm going to need your help. We walked back out into the night. The party was still going on in the distance, the sound of laughter and the fiddle drifting over the trees like a lullaby. But we didn't go back to the tables just yet. We walked to the rowan tree at the edge of the property, the place where we had made our very first promise all those years ago. The tree was tall now, its branches reaching for the moon. I reached out and touched the bark, feeling the strength of it. "We grew up, didn't we?" I asked. Arthur nodded. "We did, but we kept the best parts of the kids we were. We kept the hope." I looked up at the sky, at the vast, indigo expanse that stretched out over the orchard, the village, and the rolling hills of the only home I'd ever truly known. The world felt big, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a garden waiting to be tended. "To the future," I said, raising an imaginary glass to the moon. "To the future," Arthur echoed, squeezing my hand. "And to the puddles. May we always have the right boots to jump in them." I laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed through the trees. I didn't need to make a wish on a star tonight. I didn't need to look for signs or portents. The promise was no longer a thing of the past, a ghost haunting our steps. It was the soil beneath our feet, the air in our lungs, and the light in our windows. As we walked back toward the cottage, the yellow of my wellies catching the light of the lanterns, I knew that the story didn't end here. The happily ever after wasn't a static thing, a frozen moment in time. It was the beginning of 1,000 ordinary days of rain, days of sun, days of planting, and days of harvest. And as the door of our cottage clicked shut, sealing us inside our own little world of blue paint and apple blossoms, I knew that we were ready for every single one of them. The wait was over. The growth had begun. We weren't just waiting to grow up anymore. We were simply, beautifully living.